crystallized really in my mind in 2015, 2016, when I spent a lot of my time in Ramallah and Jerusalem working as an advisor for the UN to the Palestinian Authority. It occurred to me, all sorts of things started to occur to me about this subject and how it might be managed to be brought to life. Chris, if we could scroll down to the first slide in the deck. Is that possible? Is Chris there? Right, the first slide after this. Thank you. And I just wanted to, this is the most sort of dense copy slide, I think, in just a few bullet points. I wanted to put this slide up here because it just, it synthesizes the major themes in this book, which are really the kind of engine of it. Firstly, I think we're seeing a mobilization of public opinion as an existential force, as a political and social force in the Middle East, which has, for the first time, started to move beyond the old stereotypes of the Arab street, this rather kind of term that's become rather negative, that was developed by Nasser in the 1950s. So we're starting to hear all of these voices in the region: women, professionals, students, young people, entrepreneurs. The mobilization of public opinion, in my view, is the single biggest irresistible force at work in the Middle East. The second point is that since the Arab events of the Arab Spring of 2011 and the Nile Spring of 2019, these voices have become much more of an existential threat to many of the regimes in the Middle East. And a number of paradoxes really informing this book. One of them is that the Middle East is actually undergoing this extraordinary process of modernization of its government institutions. And one of the impacts of the Arab Spring and the Nile Spring has been for the penny to drop amongst many governments in the Middle East, that the old command and control model of dominating the information flow within these countries is no longer working. And they are having to think about how they build links to their own populations, links which have been disturbed by the arrival of wholesale new media, social media and digital media, which is revolutionizing these old, the need for to change these old models. A couple of other things too I want to show in the book, one of which is the evolution of propaganda itself. So to unpack the terminology of propaganda and show that it's not really just one homogeneous idea, but it's something that's actually evolved over time. So I wanted in the book to show a continuum, and I've got a chart which will do that in a minute. And then finally, I think the thread I wanted to pick up was how the eclipse of Western narratives and Western methodology in the region, how that has declined and how it's been overtaken by Islamic State since 2014, an organization that has managed to take propaganda and develop it into information war in an entirely new way, has taken it to new places, used new methods of distribution, new tactics, and there is an extraordinary lesson there to be learned. So these themes are the ones which I've picked up in the book largely. We can move on to the next slide, Chris. Okay, this is one of the, I suppose you call it, it's a kind of motif and a bit of intellectual glue in this book. And I don't suppose, unless you've been in the communications business, Harold Lasswell isn't really a guy who will resonate very, very loudly in your world. But he was a giant of his age, of the 20s, a political scientist, a communications theorist, the first person to model the process of propaganda. The inventor of the concept of scientific democracy as well. He's a major figure in this world of communications. And he was the first person to map the use of state propaganda by the Allies in the First World War. And as a motif for information warriors, I've used this quote from Harold Laswell's book about propaganda techniques and how they were used by liberal democracies in the First World War. And you can see from that it's a three-legged stool: military pressure, economic pressure, and propaganda, which he defines as the direct use of suggestion. And my idea in this was that, I've read a great deal in my own life as a communicator, as a Middle East watcher, about the military and the economic dimensions and many of the cultural dimensions of the Middle East through the ages. But I've read much less about the propaganda. So this is a motif that appears through the course of the book, and I say a bit about Laswell in the book. Thanks, Chris. We could move on to the next slide, I think. Right, now, I think there are those of you who may know this guy, John Rendon. If you don't, let me tell you a tiny bit about him, because he's the first person to have coined the phrase information warrior. He is the man who was tasked by George W. Bush to sell the case for regime change in Iraq in early 2000. He's the guy who came up with the idea of the Iraqi National Congress. He is the guy who found Ahmed Shalabi as the president in waiting. He is the guy who spent the dollars on the media relations campaigning, and he is the guy who invented this pernicious and pervasive form of propaganda known as perception management, which was used in the end to change the entire media environment in Iraq post-invasion, post-2003. He's a mysterious figure. He's not somebody who shows his face very much, but he is somebody, and his organization, on who the American government have spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to manipulate the media environment in Iraq and other places around the world, Kuwait, cut his teeth in Panama. Much has been written about him. If you're looking for something definitive, you could read a book called Weapons of Mass Deception by Sheldon Rampton and John Stauber, which I've used in this book. But he's a truly influential man, and somebody whose story is very much stitched into Information Warriors. Thanks, Chris. Right, so look, here's the first of the 3 charts that I had commissioned. I actually found a guy in Sydney, in Australia. When I spent, as Sue, my wife will know, I spent about 3 months with charts up on my walls in the house, trying to figure out how to show some of the themes in this book. And the first one is the development of these propaganda models, because as I was saying a minute ago, I set out to show that propaganda is not something that is a static, homogeneous idea that just travels through the ages in the same form, but it's something that's morphed massively, and in many respects is, I think, hidden and also little understood. And if you enter this chart on the left-hand side, which you can see I've plotted the development of these models of propaganda against milestones in the last century of the Middle East, starting really with the death of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, and the First World War itself about a century ago. And in 1914, when Britain went to war, and Britain, of course, went to war in the Middle East as well, we really didn't have a great propaganda capability, and the science, for want of a better word, was very underdeveloped. So the first sort of incarnation of propaganda used in the First World War, developed by the Allies and the Germans in the First World War, principally had these sort of main features: media relations, press releases, photo opportunities, press offices, the first documentary films, and of course the first atrocity propaganda, where we tried to show the barbarism of the Germans. And this systematic propaganda is called that because it was the first time people have tried to make it into a manageable discipline. In the 20s and 30s, I've called, well, it's generally considered to be scientific propaganda, which imports much more complex typically Freudian psychology into the business of influencing public opinion, imported by principally Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the inventor of public relations, somebody who realized that the world needed a mechanism for selling ideas. And so the giants of the 20s and 30s who really thought through this process of how to influence and manage public opinion, Bernays, Walter Lippmann, who wrote Public Opinion in 1922, Harold Laswell, we've already mentioned. Major features of this type of propaganda were the major mechanisms were radio, which was a massive, by far the biggest, superseded newspapers in the 20s and 30s as a way of communicating with populations. Personality, look at Mussolini, look at Hitler, look at Lawrence of Arabia, look at all of these sort of personality cults. And further development of film. Through the 40s, the development of specialist propaganda, which includes much more arcane things like psychological operations and information operations, which is much more closed, opaque ways of influencing opinion, managed typically by the military. And then in the 50s and 60s, we moved into the era of what's known as public diplomacy and soft power, which I think are two terms people often don't understand. But public diplomacy, which is where Britain puts its propaganda effort, is really the pursuit of state policy aims by non-state instruments. So the great instruments of public diplomacy and its travelling companion, soft power, would be organisations in this country such as the BBC and the British Council will be two big examples of British public diplomacy and soft power instruments. Then we move through the Iraq wars of Desert Shield, Desert Storm and Iraqi freedom, and we see that propaganda has become something much more pernicious, much more intrusive. We find that much of our national narrative and brand has been outsourced to specialists, to private sector specialists like John Rendon and PR firms like Hill and Knowlton, who sold the invasion of Kuwait to the American public. And then on the right-hand side of the chart, we find we've arrived at the age of information war, what's now sometimes now known as fourth generation war or hybrid war. And the paradoxes here are huge because the advances in this information war, this media jihad, have largely been made by Islamic State, who have introduced social and digital media, atrocity propaganda, which is reliant on very violent and very memorable images, who've developed film and video to another level, which we'll come on to in a minute. Just aware of the time. So that's a good sort of, what I've tried to do is construct a snapshot so that people can see that when they use the word propaganda and its application in the Middle East, that we're talking about something that's much more sophisticated than that, and that's developed over time in a much more pervasive way. So I think with that, we could move on to the second chart. Right, I've called this Britain's propaganda factory. I could have called it Britain's information state, But I've put it up here because it's illustrative. Again, I've plotted it against the main milestones in the development of the Middle East over the last century. And I think it's instructive because it shows, as you can see, roughly speaking, a kind of rise and then a decline in Britain's information capacity and in the success of its efforts, if you like. And I think if you enter this chart in the bottom left-hand quarter, again at the start of the First World War, it's reasonable to say that Britain had no propaganda expertise or capacity at all. And slowly through the progress of the First World War, it built up to the point where in 1918 we created our first Ministry of Information. Now, the Ministry of Information is something that is redolent with, with implied meanings. But in 1918, it took responsibility for the national propaganda and information output. And we had our first information minister, who ironically was Lord Beaverbrook, who I think I'm right in saying was Canadian. But the responsibility for propaganda in Turkey and the Middle East was coalesced into one function of the Ministry of Information. And probably the consummate achievement of that system in the Middle East anyway was the entry of British forces into Jerusalem on the 11th of December 1917, which was made into a film by a guy called Harold Jeeps, working for the War Office Cinematographic Committee, and constructed a film which has gone on to become, I mean, when it was shown in 1918 in Britain very widely, it was probably the biggest PR coup of the war that the British had. And the associations of the reoccupation of Jerusalem were such that every church bell in Rome was rung continuously for an hour. So after that, disbanded in 1918, reconstituted at the start of the Second World War, and then ramped up into a huge operation staffed by 3,000 people, responsible for every aspect of the state effort to put its narratives in place and manage its information outputs. And you can see, amazing, some of them very short-lived, but we had 6 more information ministers, the longest standing one of whom was Brendan Bracken, who was Churchill's, was a side man of Churchill's. I think here, just to take a minute, this is where, in my view, Britain's ability to manage its reputation effectively in the Middle East hit its real stumbling blocks with the abandonment of its game plan in Palestine in 1948. The Ministry of Information was actually downsized in 1946. I think Britain was unable to construct a convincing narrative about its departure from Palestine, a narrative that was, I mean, I think even now affects our reputation in the region. At 1956, we arrive at the Suez Crisis, which is probably the defining moment for the British Empire in terms of our decline as a power in the region and in the world. And by the time Suez came around, Anthony Eden, who was in charge of the British information effort, put himself in charge rather unwisely of our information effort in Suez. He really had a machine that was only firing on 2 cylinders, because in 1946 the Central Office Information had been founded, and responsibility for different parts of communicating our national narrative had been fragmented, had been split up between the Foreign Office, the Colonial Office, or the Colonial Office, and the Dominion Office. So we started to have a very fragmented, to give a very fragmented account of what we were doing in the Middle East. And of course, what we did at Suez was catastrophic in terms of our reputation, and hammered a nail into it, from which we've never really, in my view, we've never emerged, and certainly never emerged as as authoritative a way. This Central Office of Information model proceeded across the Iraq wars until it was finally abandoned in 2011. Cuts of one kind or another, resources and people, have resulted in a government communications service, which is pretty much a kind of support department. But the responsibility, this is where I think the story gets terribly opaque. I'm talking about Britain here rather than the States, but trying to unravel and decipher what Britain is actually doing in the Middle East in terms of how we're communicating our policy objectives there and our interventions there has become extremely hard to pin down. I found in the course of researching this book a quote from a guy called Mark Curtis, who's a historian writing in Middle East Eye in this time last year, actually. His article was called British Foreign Policy in the Middle East, A Secret History of Self-Interest. And the quote I picked out was, British foreign policy is so centralized that it is akin to an authoritarian regime. And down at the bottom right-hand corner of this chart, you can see these three units that I've found, which none of which promote or publicize what they're doing. The only information I can find really is about the counter-Daesh communications cell, which is part of a coalition of 73 countries, I think, which operates a sort of PR publicity initiative from a place called the Sawab Center in the UAE. So I think in this chart, I've tried to show the rise of our information state to its zenith under Brendan Bracken and his Ministry of Truth, because of course George Orwell served in his Ministry of Information, and its decline into something much more fragmented and much more opaque, and actually much less accountable. And one of the things I've argued for in this book is that we should have some way of connecting all of these bits of our national narrative and our national information effort together. So I think this would probably bring me to perhaps to the final chart. Okay, and this is, as you can see, a chart that tries to bring together the use of film as a propaganda tool and how it's been used in the Middle East. And it is a kind of extraordinarily interesting and engrossing aspect of dimension of the propaganda effort, and it's one which I personally have had a lot of fun looking into, because of course I've sat down and watched all these movies. And if we come into this chart from the top left-hand corner, in 1916, we can see these seminal films, the Battle of the Somme, made by Gilbert Malins in 1916, and the Battle of the Ancre, made in 1917, obviously both of them on the Western Front. These films were absolutely seminal films. They were the first ever documentary films of life in the trenches on the Western Front, and they were seen massively at home as a way of actually connecting people, often with their own families who were serving in the trenches. And then directly below that, in the First World War, in the Middle East, I think Britain made a total of about 250 feature films in the World War I. Significant numbers of them were made about our war in the Middle East, and of course, our war in the Middle East was a great boon to the British authorities, because quite apart from the sort of war of attrition in the Flanders mud, the Middle East provided opportunities for nobility of purpose the romance of war, horse, cavalry units, generals, riding over the sand hills, and you can see some of the motifs in this film explain why Islamic State have started to cane us as crusaders, because we took a great delight with the advance of the Crusaders into Mesopotamia and the new Crusaders, the campaign with Allenby in Gaza, and our entry into Jerusalem, of bigging up the connection between the medieval Crusades and the war with the Ottoman Turks. And this dimension of film was very much welcomed by the British government, because it was able to paint a picture of success, and it re-established the romance, as I say, and the kind of the nobility of war, perhaps most exemplified in the films made by Lowell Thomas about T. Lawrence, the preeminent figure to emerge from the First World War in the Middle East. And on the right-hand side, if I can take you over to the right-hand side of this chart, you can see how film has been entirely dominated by Islamic State. And since 2014, it's made nearly 800 films. These have been tracked by the International Centre for Counterterrorism in The Hague, and they have minutely analysed Islamic State's output of film. And I picked out a few because, for different reasons, I need to watch the time, so I'll be quick. For different reasons, they're extraordinary films, starting out with the spread of the Caliphate in 2014, made with Vice News. And the cleverness of making a film like this, which was the first inside look at the Caliphate that we ever received, and as such, it was an unveiling of this extraordinary movement on the ground, gave Islamic State a kind of credibility and endorsement, and it was part of a deal that their media team did with Vice News to give them exclusive access. And it's a 45-minute film. You can see it on YouTube. It's amazing to see how consummately they thought it through, and what a recruitment tool it's turned out to be. Widely seen, widely shown, enabled and allowed by us. I think that has its own set of questions attached. And then I think the other two I would pick out very quickly, in 2015, Healing the Believer's Chests, which is a 23-minute Arabic language film made about the capture and execution of Lieutenant Moaz Kassasbeh, the Jordanian fighter pilot. This film hits new depths of atrocity propaganda, truly 21st century atrocity propaganda. But the way that it combines news footage, archive film, collage, graphic design, interviews, drone footage, extraordinary technical capacity for a media team to produce a film like that in those circumstances. And then finally, I pick out this old idea of the sort of Lord Haw idea of putting a front man in to sell an idea, which is it's a very old PR idea. In this case, the poor, still missing, unfortunate John Cantley, who produced a series of films for Islamic State called Lend Me Your Ears. You may remember he popped up in Kobani telling us that it was never going to fall, or the Islamic State was, I'm sorry, Islamic State were going to capture it. He turned up in Mosul. He did a series on Sharia law and justice under the rule of Islamic State. So these tremendously clever films that they produce, which lots of millions and millions of people have seen their use of social and digital platforms to distribute them. All of this has eclipsed the capacity of the West to construct and communicate its own narratives about what's been going on in the region. And I think as an expression of how to purposefully roll out a media strategy with a dedicated media team in this way that Islamic State have managed to do. I mean, I've only ever found one tiny parallel really to Islamic State in terms of the Islamic jihadist capacity to organise, and that's Hezbollah. But that's much, much smaller and much less well developed. So I think that's probably, I'll call it quits there because I've been going on probably a bit too long. I know we started late, but that's perhaps a reasonable. There were other charts. I did actually make another chart of the main seminal works which have influenced the development of propaganda, which is kind of interesting too, and of the people. But I think that would have to maybe do another time. But I hope that's just been. I hope it's been interesting. I hope it's given you a sort of a flavour of some of what's in the book. It's an imperfect beast of a book because it covers a very long time span. But I hope it's not too technical. I've tried to give it an insight, a bit of a technical perspective in how these things have been done. But I'll perhaps stop there and hand back to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Viv. That's great. And we're getting some questions in. If people could submit them on the chat, that would be great. But I just wanted to kick off with one, if I may. In looking at Britain's information propaganda output, I mean, there's some very few highs and quite a lot of lows, if I may say so. I mean, what do you think was the most disastrous moment of Britain's information management, in this period you've looked at?
Well, I think I think the answer to that would have to be Suez, because I think so much was at stake at Suez for Britain, and we lost. We lost so much at Suez, but the information. I think there are two answers to your questions, Chris. One is Suez, and I would stick with it. Excuse me. I think the handling of the Suez crisis by Anthony Eden personally led him to take some terrible decisions, which were to introduce censorship, in effect, in peacetime, through the use of D-notices, which were then exposed by the newspapers. And secondly, of course, it caused him. It caused him to lie in Parliament, and his media strategy was based on a set of lies, hiding the agreement that he'd made with Israel and France in October 1956, and lying about it in Parliament. And it was a catastrophic episode for Britain in terms of our reputation in the Middle East. And I think it was catastrophic personally for Eden, who actually until then had been a bit of a poster boy for British conservative politics. A very accomplished, a man, ironically, a man who was an Arabist. It's forgotten
as well, I think, didn't
he? He got a first class double first from Oxford in Farsi and Arabic. And I think the second thing, very briefly, actually, in answer to your question, is, I'm afraid, Tony Blair's invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the dodgy dossier. And the dodgy dossier, which is a PR output. Make no mistake about that, which we will see, I suppose, when the records reveal it in 20 years. Broadly speaking, was a disaster. I mean, you know, the claim that Saddam Hussein could put battlefield nuclear weapons up in the air in 45 minutes, which was the thing that sold the case for the war in Iraq to the British Parliament, turned out to be
chemical weapons, I think.
Entirely untrue. Chemical weapons, forgive me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think.
Yeah. Sorry, did you have something to add there? I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I think that's. I mean, I think the answer to the question is Suez by a mile.
Right. So we got a question from Brodie McDonald. I don't know if Brodie, if you want to put your question. Hi, if you unmute.
Hi.
Hi, Brodie. No,
I don't.
Yeah. No. Well, I'm gonna have to speak it out. Brodie has asked about if there's any discussions in the book about state broadcasters like Al Jazeera, TRT World, etc. Of course, many of these are multiplied in recent years, and their impact on the information world in the Middle East.
Well, there is some in the chapter I wrote about Iraq. One of the two chapters I wrote primarily about Iraq, and actually going back to John Rendon. There is Al Jazeera does come into the story quite heavily, because Al Jazeera was targeted very specifically by US perception management in Iraq as being an existential threat to being able to sell the US narrative, you know, because I mean, Al Jazeera is it's a broadcasting brand, but it's almost bigger than that, and so they did a lot to try and take out reporting by Al Jazeera journalists, you know, in terms of discrediting reports, blocking transmissions. And then Al Jazeera does come up again, actually, in the book, in the context of the rather little known about PR war that's been waged between Qatar and Saudi Arabia over the last 2 years. And Al Jazeera has been a major component in that sort of fight to get across the Qatari narrative in the war that's been going on between the two states for ascendancy in the Gulf. So I haven't got, I think there probably is room for, I think other people have written probably in some depth about Al Jazeera. Yeah, but
I can plug an event we have on Thursday, actually, with Christian Ulrichsen, who's just written a book on the Gulf crisis. Of course, not just Saudi Arabia, but also particularly the Emirates. So there's a chance there, 11 o'clock on Thursday. Plug that one. Now, Gillian Mosley has a question. Gillian.
How do you see us, I'm being very optimistic here, how do you see us turning the tide of these information wars?
Well, I've in the book, I've made tried to make a case really for, I've have to be careful using terms like the West, but I mean, I know most about Britain, I suppose. I've made a case for, and I'm not the only one, for Britain rethinking its capacity and its intentions in the information and communications sphere. So whilst I haven't gone backwards and I'm not advocating that we have a Ministry of Information, I am advocating that somehow we take charge of the fragmentation of our information effort, so that we have a consolidated, sensible way. Actually, much as David Miliband argued for when he was Foreign Secretary in 2009, that allows us to communicate with more than what he was calling at the time the elites. But I think we need to start engaging with some of these other more democratic and more widespread voices in the region. So I've made a plea for that sort of, structurally, that we should have a mechanism that's much more fit for purpose, so that people, I mean, if you go in now and try and find out what Britain's foreign policy objectives are and what our modus operandi is in the Middle East, trust me, you're going to find it extraordinarily difficult to get an answer to that question. And if I was to throw around, alliances like the Deauville Partnership, which we're part of, which we joined in 2013, I doubt if there are many people out there today who really know what the Deauville Partnership is.
Indeed.
Let me pose that question. Does anyone know what the Deauville Partnership is? Well, it's our organised response to support the reforming Arab countries, Arabic-speaking countries in the Middle East who were part of the Arab Spring. I mean, who knew that we were in a form of organised activity to support these countries with help in banking, in loans, in small business startups, with women entrepreneurs. We're supposedly doing all these things, but we don't know about them, and then we don't hear about them. So that's my answer. I think we have to have a sort of institutional rethink, and then we have to have a think about our objectives and the people we want to engage with, and the content we produce. So I think it's pretty comprehensive rethink.
Strangely enough, Caabu is part of an event on the Deauville Partnership about women in business some years back. And indeed, in terms of Britain's information crisis management, I think the coronavirus probably highlights certain deficiencies in our information efforts. But anyhow, we now have Hussein Khalil. Are you with us, Hussein? Perhaps you'd like to ask your question?
I guess my question is within the context of the Arab Spring and how social media kind of defined that information war as, let's say, a landscape. And based on that, I'm wondering, from the emerging information communication technologies, how and where do you believe the next war on information war in the media is going to be played out?
Well, I think in a way that's kind of already started, because as I said at the beginning, I think these models. I mean, information and communications is absolutely central to the way that governments proceed, in the way that they do their business and talk to their people and talk to the outside world. And I think the next war, in a sense, is already happening, because one of the things I talk about in the book that's happened over the last 20 years, I think, since Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the appearance on the scene of people like John Rendon and others, Bell Pottinger, and these kind of these real heavyweights in communications practice, has been the transfer of knowledge and skills to organizations and governments in the region. So I think the next phase of the information war, and we were already seeing it actually, is the wars being fought between, the PR wars being fought between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. I mean, these the Saudi quartet, the UAE, Bahrain, they're all now operating at a different sort of level of professionalism and skill in the use of some of these techniques and tools. So I feel that's the battle for hearts and minds, as it were, in the Arabic-speaking world is moving into the region, and we're seeing it, in the I mentioned briefly the organization of Hezbollah. It has a very sophisticated media department, driven by quite grand media goals and objectives. So I think all organizations are getting better at promoting themselves. And I think now that they've got social and digital media distribution and tools, then that, for me, that the next phase of this information war is going to be in the region. And it's
between players in the region rather than an external influence on the region. Is that what you mean?
Well, I think there will. Yes, I personally think that you know, I've sided a bit with Lawrence, Professor Lawrence Friedman at King's College, but I tend to think that the age of as far as the West goes, the age of interventions is really over. Mm. And I think that, you know, the other powers that are moving in to soak that vacuum up, to fill that vacuum, are other players. You know, Russia, Iran, Turkey. So I don't suppose. I think we need to talk to people. We need to have relationships with people in this region. It's no less vital than it's ever been. But I think you know, our voices are going to be harder to be heard, as we frankly have no hard power left.
Viv, can I just follow up on that? Because there's another element to this, and what we're seeing is that increasingly using very advanced software tools, cyber tools, etc., that it's not even just control, it's a mechanism of actually controlling the individual, in a sense that they can track you, listen to you, you know, watch what you are doing through all these social media networks. I mean, how do you see that going forward?
You mean it's a very personally intrusive?
Yes, with apps like Pegasus that the Israelis developed.
Yeah.
The things that the Saudis have been using, and even now during the coronavirus, the way in which, you know, Israel in particular is using, you know, this sort of software, this very software to track people, what they're doing at any given moment. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to punt myself around as a you know, an authority on cyber warfare. I think that, you know, there are lots of people who are looking at that for sure, and it's introduced another dimension. There's no doubt about that. I think that the only aspect of this I sort of touched on in the book, tackled in the book, is the inability of, or the increasing inability of media organizations to be able to control the flow of, the inability of governments to be able to influence the control the flow of information from conflict zones, simply because with the development of satellite technology and satellite phones and uplinks and all the rest of it, you know, you can't. Censorship doesn't really work in the same way anymore. That's one of the problems that the Saudis have found, you know, with Khashoggi. So you can't keep a lid on things anymore. But the drone surveillance and the corona tracking is, you know, I observe that. I don't know much about that, so I would hate to pump myself around as someone who's an authority. But it is worth noting, I think, that Israel is a leader. I mean, Israel is not a global leader, is it not, in drone technology and security fencing?
Yes.
Surprise, surprise. Yeah.
Right. We've probably got time for one more question if there is one. I mean, I was also curious about your chapter on, you know, the output of so-called Islamic State Daesh. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, how they managed to, you know, tap into this information world. I mean, you seem to be very impressed, you know, in your chapter by their output, not from an ethical point of view. It's gory and violent, but I mean, they really study Bernays and all these other sort of giants of the propaganda war. Would they be familiar with some of this, the people who are at the top end of the organization?
Well, when you look at the people who I mean, first of all, when you look at one of their films, which I've put on this infographic actually, made in 2016, called "The Structure of the Caliphate," is an astounding film because it really sets out the entire organizational thinking behind the structure of the Caliphate, Islamic State, and it has one diwan, which I think is a Turkish term. You could be corrected if I'm wrong about that. But one, in effect, one diwan, a ministry dedicated entirely to media, and it's populated. The structure of this diwan, which had, by the way, I think he's called Abu Muhammad al-Furqan, was the first Islamic State Minister of Information. In this diwan, they had, an astonishingly sophisticated organization which comprises press offices, regional press offices around the Caliphate, very strict control over their messaging, press guidelines. They had 2 news agencies. They have a monthly magazine, Al-Ramia. They have a photographic unit. They've got a social and digital media unit. The organisation of this media infrastructure is extraordinarily reminiscent of a very sophisticated Western government or corporation, actually. Although corporations tend not to have their own news agencies. So it's more akin to a government. And I think the answer to your question is yes, they've studied very, very carefully people like Bernays. Maybe they haven't gone back, but I've mentioned, the works that the fundamentals of how you engage, capture, manage, dominate public opinion haven't really changed since the 20s and the 30s. It's the tools that have changed. And so the notion of Edward Bernays, which the big idea behind public relations, which is different, makes it different from advertising, is that you don't say something is great yourself. You get a third party who your audience respects to say that it's great, and hence the cleverness of Islamic State going to Vice News and getting Vice News to make a film about life in the Caliphate. And what does that do? It's an incredibly clever way of transferring the pitch for credibility to an independent news organisation. Now that is a very sophisticated thing to do.
And we have one question also from Brodie McDonald, and I won't call him because he was struggling with the microphone earlier on. Sorry, Brodie, but he says, great presentation, thank you. I had one further, slightly more complicated question if there's time. Whilst ISIL's media output from 2013 to 2017 was impressive, they've appeared to be largely contained by the countermeasures taken by the coalition against Daesh and big tech. As you all know, many Twitter accounts and other platforms were taken down. So he wants to know if Salafi jihadist groups can hope to win the information war in the future, and how can they match the overwhelming resources that governments and big tech have brought against them in information warfare? I mean, do they have a chance of coming back in this domain?
Well, I think those observations that Brodie makes are accurate. I think I don't know, Brodie, whether you are aware of an organisation called VoxPoll, but there's a European organisation called VoxPoll. Don't ask me what it stands for, but I've been to a few of their extraordinarily interesting lectures at King's College where they talk about exactly what's going on to counter Salafi jihadist propaganda, most particularly Islamic State, up to 2017. And you're right, I think, Brodie. There has been a massive containment of propaganda, but actually, as the physical degradation of the caliphate progressed, so that it was really eradicated in late 2018. I think that governments and this coalition that operates from the UAE, from this Sawab Center, which coordinates anti-IS propaganda efforts, it's had some real success, and I think it will be much harder as the internet is policed more for similar organizations to create such an impact, because I don't think that we will be swallowing the same pill again in quite the same way. So what was extraordinary was the notion that you could put somebody in an orange boiler suit like David Haynes, kneel them down on a bit of dirt outside Raqqa and execute them, and have that played on the 10 o'clock news, on Sky News the same day. That's not going to happen anymore, I don't think. That chapter's over. But I think what is disturbing, and I think I made a mention of it in the book, is the fact that an organization like Islamic State is sitting on a warehouse stockpile mountain of propaganda. And of course it will find ways of releasing it. It's very hard to block every every mouse hole in the house. So I think this is going to, it's going to continue to be. If you go onto the Islamic State outlets, which people do. Sadly, I had to do a little bit for this book. You see that they're uploading stuff all the time. They're uploading stuff from sub-Saharan Africa, from Afghanistan, from North Africa, from all over the place. So I think yes, there's a certain part of that battle that's been won, but I think it's an ongoing propaganda information war. I think it's ongoing. I think it's going to be with us.
Indeed, and I'm reminded of the way in which they sent out messages to all their supporters and members or whatever to avoid Europe and such like during the virus, maintaining some sort of organizational information service to its devotees. I think at this point I'm going to draw this webinar to an end, and to thank Viv for talking so clearly and coherently about this topic over a span of a century of propaganda and information warfare. It's been absolutely fascinating. And just to remind you, the link is there on the chat, Gilgamesh Books. There should be an e-version of it coming out later today, and hopefully hard copy books will be also available.
Inshallah.
We also, just to sort of plug various other things, we have this event on Thursday on the Gulf crisis, what Viv talked about earlier, Qatar. It's a members-only event, so it's a chance for those who aren't members of Caabu, and I hope you will join to join us. And we'll be with Christian Ulrichsen, who has written several books on the Gulf before. We also will be doing future webinars and stuff, and if people have suggestions, etc., please do get in touch and let us know. We're always available for ideas, what you want to hear about, what topics, what speakers, and we can try to deliver that for you. We have ideas, etc., but in these times, obviously, we can't do real live events. It all has to be virtual. And with that, I think is just to say, I hope you're all well, look after yourselves, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see as many of you as possible on Thursday.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you everybody for joining, and stay in touch.